This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2016 conference of the Association for Israel Studies here in Jerusalem. My guest today is a doctoral student in political science at the University of Pennsylvania, whose research focuses on cosmopolitanism and Levantinism among young Mizrahi radicals in Israel. Zachary Smith, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi Gilad, thanks for having me.
So these young Mizrahi people are radical because they promote two isms, cosmopolitanism and Levantinism, that are anathema to the rooted and Western society that the founding fathers of Zionism sought to establish?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I pose in my research that Levantinism is a subset of cosmopolitanism, and I think that we can think of cosmopolitanism as really having two big strands, one of which is this kind of idea that we can kind of be at home without the nation state. We can live maybe most at home in the BA lounge at Heathrow Airport. And this isn't really the cosmopolitanism.
Sounds like home to me, yeah.
Right. This isn't the cosmopolitanism that really interests these Mizrahim and their cultural production. Rather, what interests them is perhaps a second type of cosmopolitanism, one that is intensely tied to the idea of belonging to a place and to the people and cultures that are in it that produce a certain sort of kind of hybrid culture produced by difference.
Is the attitude of the Israeli establishment or the Israeli psyche equally hostile to the two, or is it fully hostile altogether?
I think, and we've heard a lot about this at this conference actually, that Israeli society is broadly dominated by an Ashkenazi perspective that sees Israel as kind of a small or becoming part of Europe, or a part of Europe already, and one with a broadly Western orientation, a secular orientation, one that promotes a sort of liberal project. And this project has the side effect of kind of erasing and suppressing some of the other cultures that already exist here, including the cultures of Mizrahi Jews, not only them, but of course of Ethiopians, of former Soviet Union Jews, and of indigenous Palestinian Arabs. And the reason that the Levantinism that these Mizrahim promote in their poetry and in their activism is perceived as so hostile is that it invites Israel to not perhaps give up entirely on a Western orientation, but to integrate that Western viewpoint into some other Eastern viewpoints that can kind of exist as a meshing of cultures writ large.
Don't they tend to bask in some sort of romanticism that is really not grounded in reality?
What, do you mean the
radicals?
The radicals? Yeah, I mean, it's a romantic ideal, a vision of the future that obviously doesn't necessarily reflect what Israel is like today, but it's an idea of wanting to make Israel, and I make this point in the paper, more like what they imagine Casablanca or Istanbul to be, less like what Paris or Berlin, though that's now populated by Israelis too, or London or New York can be. It's an idea where we can have really co-production and coexistence of different communities that still retain the things that make them distinctive, but are able to produce things together.
Do they ever address the feasibility of their project, or does it really stay in the realm of ideas and discussion?
I think they don't address the feasibility, and I think that there are a couple of reasons for that. One of which is that I'm not sure it's the job of artists to promote a feasible path to getting to their solution. Rather, it might be the job of artists and creative intellectuals to articulate a certain vision for the future, and the job of other people to kind of find ways to make that work. So certainly poets are not giving you, along with their vision and their poetry, a path to how to get to the vision. And even the activists who I look at in the article and their activism, in writing letters or open letters to Arab peers across the border of Israel in the Arab Spring in 2011 are not saying, this is how we're going to get to a place where we can have a pluralistic Middle East where Israel is really part of the region. They're saying that this is what we want us to be, and we're ready to make that step.
Is anybody engaging in the practical aspects of it, other than those people that...
So, this isn't part of my paper, but it's part of my next research. There are two new Mizrahi political movements in Israel that have gained a lot of traction, at least in the media, over the past few months. One is Tor Zahav, the Golden Age, which promotes kind of a reshaping of Mizrahi and Ashkenazi, or maybe even a flip of that particular class structure in Israeli society. And they don't necessarily engage as much in this, even though some of their founders have in the past. The other is a group called Mizrahi Mishutefet, the Mizrahi Palestinian Partnership. And in talking with the poets and the activists who are part of this, these people are engaging in meetings with Mizrahi members of communities inside Israel, Palestinians who live inside Israel, and Palestinians who live in the territories, including Palestinians who are members of the Knesset, in order to kind of find ways to advance the goals that can help make Israeli society a bit more pluralistic. They talk about the cancellation of the psychometric exam, the teaching of Arabic in all levels of schools, things like that can slowly start to take Israel towards the vision that they articulated. We're now in 2016, 5 years ago in 2011.
How different, in this respect specifically, are they different from Shas, for example, or other Mizrahi movements that are less radical and perhaps more conservative or even orthodox?
Yeah, I think in their attention to the Palestinian issue as inseparable from the Mizrahi issue, in other words, their attention to Israel's environment and its neighbors and even the neighbors who are within, if you will, as inseparable from solving the Mizrahi oppression and solving the Mizrahi struggle in Israeli society, that's what makes them different from Shas. This is not a position that we necessarily see Aryeh Deri advocating. It's not also a position that we saw some of the young Mizrahi intellectuals who backed Shas in the last election really articulating as part of their message. They were articulating things that were strictly related to the Mizrahi struggle. And while it's perhaps a necessarily incomplete answer for some of these poets and activists.
So do you think that this is really a fundamental difference? Does it really determine the worldviews so separately?
For me, I'm not so sure. The activists that I talk to, on the other hand, do think of it as fundamental. They really see a sharp distinction between the time aspect of when one conducts the struggle and in what stages. So when they criticize people in say, the left wing of the Shas movement or Tor Zahav for perhaps advocating solving the Mizrahi issue first before the Palestinian issue, they say that actually you cannot do that. You need to be able to tackle both at once, and for them that is fundamental. Now, it happens to be that their goals tend to overlap. The teaching of Arabic in schools is something that a lot of people can get behind, including Ashkenazim.
And also doing away with social inequality along ethnic lines.
Absolutely. These are things that people are agreeing on, and in that respect, I think the movements are even perhaps willing to work together, although we'll see. I mean, these are still nascent and early stages.
Yeah. How recent is this phenomenon? I mean, because we had Mizrahi protest movements from as early as the 1950s. What's really new about this latest wave?
I think you can see Mizrahi protest in both sort of continuity and in also changing over time, from Wadi Saliv to the Black Panthers to Tami and Shas and the Keshet Mizrahit Demokratit in the 90s, the Mizrahi Democratic Rainbow, to these guys. What I argue in a new paper is that actually Mizrahim have kind of, at least these activists have started to give up on formal representation in the Knesset as a way to solve their problems. Rather, they're turning toward the institutions of culture, where actually we see a tremendous rise in the Mizrahi voice in the culture section. I mean, a couple of years ago, it would be unthinkable for us to see Mizrahi poets published in the arts and culture section of Haaretz, and now if it's not daily, it's at least weekly that we're seeing.
Says
these
more
things.
About Haaretz than about those.
Perhaps that's true, but nonetheless, I mean, you see it in all newspapers and in all media that these voices of culture are gaining traction, and I think Mizrahim are seeing that in that arena, perhaps the one that Mizrahim traditionally been confined to culture, they can actually have a strong say, and maybe they can change politics from that venue. In that regard, I think they are slightly different than, say, the Panthers who were leading protests in the streets. You don't see this from the activists behind Rosh Jadida, the project I analyze in that paper, or Mizrahi Meshutefet, the current manifestation of that same movement.
Tell us a bit about really the people, the thought leaders who are behind this. They are predominantly young. I mean, they hail from a Mizrahi heritage, but they really shaped it in their own specific way. What is it really about their work, their artistic work, that stands out?
So I think there are two big strands within Mizrahi cultural production, and these are caricatures, they're simplifications, but I think that there's some resonance to this. There's kind of one of my interviewees for my paper described this as a dark strand and a light strand within Mizrahi cultural production. So the dark strand is represented by, I think you can see this very well in Mizrahi poetry. The dark strand is represented by poems like Roy Hassan's Medinat Ashkenaz, Sami Shalom Shitrit in the generation before him, Shirin Birshtadit, that really operationalize this Ashkenazi-Mizrahi divide, center-periphery divide in a very, I think, productive way for them. The light poetry, on the other hand, and this is the stuff that I analyze and the stuff that I find different, is engaged in a process of negotiating identities in public and trying to find a place between the two extremes. So the poetry of Adi Kaisar, who writes kind of between both of these genres, in one of her most famous poems, Ani HaMizrachit, I'm the Mizrahi woman, she talks about being in between things, feeling forced to choose. I'm in the middle, neither here nor there. In poems like, in other poets like Sigalit Banai's On the Blade of a Razor, she talks about wanting to see Casablanca, to read Nizar Qabbani, to watch the films of Yusuf Shaheen. These people are offering suggestions toward a future that does not depend on this very rigid Ashkenazi-Mizrahi divide, but rather tries to move it and transform it into some sort of cosmopolitan, or Levantine, as I argue, future.
Do you think that they're getting any traction within the broader Israeli discourse? You mentioned the major change that the Haaretz Literary Supplement undertook. Are we seeing anything on the broader level?
I mean, I also see, of course, they snap pictures whenever their poems are published anywhere in Israel. You see them in Yediot Achronot as well, and in other newspapers. I think that the argument that I make in my paper is that these Mizrahi voices are increasingly becoming loud and heard in Israel. I think that the question of discrimination or the Mizrahi struggle is no longer one that can kind of be swept under the rug. The activists are no longer afraid to speak out about who they are. It's not as though this was never the case. Of course, there's a long history of Mizrahi activism in Israel, but with the advent of, I think, certain types of new media technologies, we see that there's a certain ability of these activists to be vocal and to be heard by the broader society that maybe didn't exist before. And I think you can definitely see this even in old media. Adi Kaisar just came out with her second book of poetry, Muzika Gavoa, and in, I think, a week, it sold out of its first printing and had to be printed again. That's remarkable for a book of Mizrahi poetry when Sami Shalom Shitrit 20 years ago had to struggle to get his poetry published in major journals.
Now, the same question about the Arab world. They're reaching out to the cultural space. Do they get anything in return?
I think there's been a really interesting set of things that have happened over the past couple of weeks. The poet and author Almog Bahar's book, Jachle Vehezkel, was translated from English into Arabic and published in Cairo. Throughout the past few months, I've been seeing reaction from the Arab press and people reviewing it and being like, wow, so here's this Israeli Jew writing this book really about, Judaism and about Israeliness, not necessarily dealing so directly with the Arab world, and yet seeing some real positive feedback about it. He also recently sent the book to Abu Mazen in the West Bank and received a very remarkable reply. He sent it with the message, in memory of a shared past with the hope for a shared future. And Abu Mazen said, basically, I have a very busy schedule, but I'm going to make time to read the book. And that, who cares whether he really reads the book? The point is the message. Some of these things are actually being heard, and I think this proves the validity of interpersonal
But what about proud intellectuals in the Arab world, those who really dismiss any kind of connection with Israel, the anti-normalizers? Do we see any change to their position thanks to that pretty radically different rhetoric emanating from those Mizrahi intellectuals?
I think that's one area where we haven't seen so much change, and perhaps it's simply because people who are interested in anti-normalization efforts might not welcome hearing some of these topics, knowing that they're coming from Israelis, even Israelis who are writing poems in dialogue with Mahmoud Darwish. There's not, if you're already engaged in not listening to Israeli voices, it's hard for you to hear Israeli voices that might agree with you, and that can be really difficult. I have hope, on the other hand, that eventually the forces of a more pluralistic culture will win out.
All right, this is all very interesting, and I'm equally hopeful. Zachary Smith, a doctoral fellow in political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much for joining us today for a chat about cosmopolitanism and Levantinism among young Mizrahi radicals in Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilad.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcast and take your pick.
מה איתי, לא מסתדר עם עצמי. מה איתי, איפה שחר